She's a national politics reporter at the Washington Post. And you know what? I like my sister, but I wish she was kind of my sister too. My sister's not gonna like that, but Sabrina Rodriguez, make some noise. Yeah, we have sibling unity, yeah. You can catch Sabrina always on CNN. As you see her here, she doesn't even see the photo when she's on Inside Politics with John King. Also joining us, she's a fantastic NPR politics reporter. She's been on the podcast before. Ximena Bustillo, make some noise for Ximena. And last but not least, he's our favorite when we need to learn about what's happening overseas, because it's important. He's a foreign policy correspondent over at Reuters. Give some noise for Idrees Ali. Make some noise. Thank you to all three of you for being on the show. First, I just mentioned where you all work at, but let's tell the people a little bit about yourselves and what made you want to get into journalism and writing. You've been at Politico, you've been at it for a while now. You just recently got a promotion at the Washington Post. Congratulations there. So tell us a little bit about why you got into journalism.
Well, I will lead with, and I always lead with, I'm born and raised in Miami, so grew up there. But I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, which kind of sometimes comes off a little corny. Like, I remember in elementary school knowing that I wanted to do this, and then was lucky enough that in my schools growing up, middle school, high school, they had like a school newspaper, got to take those opportunities. But I think for me, the big thing was I definitely didn't know I wanted to do politics. Like for me, I was like, yeah, I would love to work at the Miami Herald and cover like local news, which I guess in Miami oftentimes does end up being politics.
You know, I live there. So.
But I didn't envision that for myself for sure. And it wasn't until I was in college and a professor suggested I do a program at Politico where I would spend 10 days in DC and kind of get a taste for political reporting that I came here, did that, and was like, oh, I love this. Like, I love like the chisme of it all and like the getting to, you know.
You gotta tell the white people what chisme means. So you can't just let that slide.
The Spanish for gossip. I love some good gossip in my social life and professionally. So getting to be a political reporter was a great way of getting to formalize that and make that a whole career. But yeah, so it's been great, and I've gotten to focus a lot on Latino voters, other voters of color, which is a kind of passion of mine, like specific interests outside of work, so getting to do it for work is great.
Ximena, what about you?
Yeah, so I grew up in Idaho, so not in the Midwest. It's further than that. I'm already just telling you.
We're adding another segment about Idaho.
Already a geography class, I tell you. I went to Boise State, which is not a journalism school, but I got involved in the student paper, and I didn't always know that I wanted to be a journalist. I thought maybe I'd go the politics route or the political science law school, grad school route at some point. But also similarly, I did that same Politico program, and that really solidified that I wanted to go into journalism. I love storytelling, I love talking to people. Like, once I started writing stories, I basically couldn't stop.
Yeah. Idrees, what about you, buddy?
So I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, and I actually went to college for business in Canada, and very quickly realized I was just not good at business, and I needed to essentially find a new career. So right after my undergrad, I went to Maryland for grad school in journalism, and I was like, oh, I'm not terrible at this. And my family basically is a bunch of journalists. My grandfather, father, mother, sister.
Look at that.
They were like, don't become a journalist. So that's exactly what I did.
Yeah. If you want to shy away from it. For each of you, I know what your crazy story is going to be because we covered it on the show when you were on, but what's a crazy story that has happened so far for each of you as journalists, or something that you've had to cover that's been wild? You've been covering some nonsensical things that have been said by family members of ours. We're not going to get into that here. Ximena, you've been covering a lot. You were just covering President Biden's conference there, and then you just went on NPR recently on the Up First, right, podcast?
Yeah, Morning Edition this morning.
Morning Edition, right, where you were talking about the baby formula shortage. Give us a crazy story, each of you, in your respective careers in journalism so far. Something that's been a little bit crazy with respect to what you've been covering, or maybe something incident-wise that happened, and we're going to get to a Idrees story in a bit.
You go first.
Yeah, so I guess a part of my background is I spent 2 years working at Politico as an agriculture policy reporter. So where your food comes from, how it's made, all very political, believe it or not. And I started in 2020, which was right at the height of the pandemic, where everything was shutting down, supply chains were crashing, and that's how I really learned the beat, was by learning how things were not working. And I think one of the craziest days was when JBS, which is one of the 4 meatpacking plants that control almost all of meatpacking products in the United States, was hacked by Russia. One specific plant was, and it went down, and we kind of sat on it for a bit, like, how seriously do we take this? Do we write something up? Do we not? And then it blew up, and suddenly I was like trying to figure out how cybersecurity worked, and meat and cows, and I like never thought those two would relate.
I still don't know how it relates. Wait, so all their systems and stuff like that,
Yes.
and the way the plant would process it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so then it got shut down, so they couldn't process meat. And the problem with the concentration is a lot of cows got processed at this very specific plant. And when that was down, it delayed the process at a point where processing was already delayed from the pandemic.
Right.
So it just created a giant backlog.
What about you, Sabrina?
Immediately what came to my mind was like crazy political rallies I've been at, or like people yelling things to me as like a member of the media. But actually this is gonna come down as like the craziest story for me. Also at Politico, I covered trade policy for a long time, and I was doing it under the Trump administration when he was doing the renegotiation of NAFTA, which is now USMCA. And this really is gonna speak to like the state of politics in the United States, why I think this is crazy. But in those negotiations, it was a big question, like, okay, are they gonna be able to pass it in Congress? Are they gonna be able to reach a deal that will have Democrats supporting it? Is it gonna be a deal that, you know, historically big free trade Republicans are gonna support? And again, we could unpack like trade policy for days, but in the end, they ended up passing it with like overwhelming support from Republicans and Democrats. Like, I remember the vote in the Senate was something like 92 to like 6, and 2 people didn't vote. Don't quote me on the exact number. And then the same thing in the House, where it was like an overwhelming majority. And I just remember thinking like, wow, this is never gonna happen again. Like, what bill is gonna get this much support?
Right.
But yeah.
Idrees, why don't you tell the people that story that you told us so eloquently on air about what happened with you on a flight with the Department of Defense?
Yeah, so I cover the Pentagon, which means I, fly with either the Defense Secretary or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. In this case, it was the Deputy Defense Secretary, and we were flying to Norway. At this point, I'd probably traveled with them about, maybe 50 times or so. Anyway, long story short, because it is a long story, but I was on the plane, it was, U.S. government plane, and the pilots came up to me when we were in mid-flight, and they said, you can't use your phone. We have a new rule, Air Force rule, saying the foreigners can no longer carry their phones with them. I was not happy, so I put my phone in the seat back pocket. A bit later, they have armed security on the plane. They came over and said, not only can you not have it, we have to take your phone away from you. This is all happening on the plane. Anyway, long story short, the rule had just been implemented, and there is only one non-American reporter.
Pray tell, who was that?
Yeah. So it was one of those incidents where it was like, highly questionable. Anyway, we landed. A lot of noise was made about it, and they, retracted that rule. But yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, if you don't know the story, check it out. Idrees Ali and all of your colleagues came to your defense right away, which was pretty cool for you to find out. Go ahead, Nick.
A couple of things about this show, just inside stuff for you all. So, first up, Ximena and I are food nerds. Agriculture reporting, I totally nerd out about it. We had talked once. You would share something at the end of an episode about that. And I remember Mike and I were texting about food. He's like, we can't talk about food. No one cares about food.
I'm already asleep.
At the very end, she starts to talk about this upcoming event going on. She's like, oh, I wish I could have a chance to speak on it. And I just mean mug Mike the whole time, like, scoreboard.
Yeah, I mean scoreboard. I don't know what that means. Yeah, so we had her do the segment with agriculture on.
Look at just running back like a defensive back.
Is there a question here, Mr.
There is a
Savari?
question. There is
Yes,
indeed a question.
Thank you.
To the three of you, right now, obviously, now I spend a lot of time in like the real print journalism. I nerd out about that often. Where do you all see currently, we played a clip earlier of the former president talking about, government officials. But that same president's also been very critical of the media. We've heard terms like fake news and all kinds of ways of demonizing the work that you've all done and many of your colleagues have done. Where do you assess the state of American journalism as of today?
Idrees, why don't you take that first? Because American journalism, as somebody born outside.
Yeah, I mean, you almost have to have different silos for different types, electronic, print. I have never been very fond of electronic or TV journalism, not because it's bad, it just has to be short and everything's boiled down.
Me too.
Yeah, so I am not as optimistic about that because I feel like things are just so simplified, it sort of misses the nuances on really important issues, in particular national security and foreign policy. More optimistic about print journalism because I think so many things that we saw during the Trump administration, which are still coming out, are investigative journalists bringing them out. And what we're seeing sort of on the January 6th Commission, a lot of it is them bringing out stuff that was reported on at the time. So yeah.
Ximena, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, that's always really tough because I am in a very fortunate position where I can do radio and broadcast and I can also do print, but like I literally turned in a 2,000-word story on baby formula yesterday and my editor was like, we can't, no one's gonna read this. And I'm like, but they should. And he's like, no, they won't though. And so that's like really tough is you're competing not just with everyone else, to get the story out, but with people's attention spans as well, which leads to a lot of other problems, like how do you promote your news stories? How do different editors promote news stories? And, before we started taping, we were talking about just local news and the state of local news. I started in local news at the Idaho Statesman. That was one of my first jobs, and I did local TV news as well, like on the production side. And I mean, it's really tough. Like the wages are really low, the income for reporters are really low, for producers, but sometimes people don't always subscribe to that. They don't always read that. And in a lot of places, subscription is still what's driving a lot of the revenue, not ad sales anymore. So it's kind of really tough to look at that.
Sabrina, what about you? Because you wrote a fantastic piece that we had you on a while back, that one in Politico, where you were covering the border and obviously some of the political theater around it, specifically from one side of the political aisle. Your thoughts on the current state of journalism, like Nick mentioned?
I mean, I think one of my biggest frustrations is the fact that there are so many amazing journalists doing amazing work, and what gets prioritized is sometimes a little out of our control. So, for example, at a publication I worked at in the past, it doesn't really matter the name. When I worked at Politico, but when I work at the Post, it doesn't matter. It's not a criticism of any of the places. I'm just thinking of like specifically when we worked at Politico together, where there's a huge focus on the political story of the day. There's a huge focus on, okay, what did Biden say today? What did he do? What did Trump say? What did Trump do? And there's hundreds of reporters there that are covering policy and are covering baby formula. And if baby formula is not the top headline of the day, that does not mean that there's not 10 people that are paying attention to it and that are following it and are covering it. And I think that's something that, especially with like Twitter brain and like seeing like social media, people will be like, nobody's paying attention to this issue. And then they're linking to a story that someone wrote about that issue.
I can't tell you how many times I've gotten, this network's not covering it, and then I send them a screenshot of the network covering it. Oh, well, I've never seen that. It's because it's 24 hours a day. You don't watch it 24 hours a day.
Yeah, and I do understand. I mean, the frustration is that it's not getting enough attention, that something is getting more attention than that. But that's sometimes, like, that's out of the control of a lot of us as reporters. Like, we would love to prioritize. I want my story to be at the top of the page every day if that were up to me.
Right. Oh, very vain of you. No, I'm kidding. But let's move into, let's get your expertise, each of you, on what's playing out now in American politics. The midterm elections are coming up. Go vote. You know it's important, everybody. Whatever state, early voting is already underway. You heard Marie in the last segment mention 11 million people have already early voted. There's a bunch of key races happening. All 435 House seats are up. There's 36 governor races. You know about the Florida one with DeSantis and Crist. Nick's in Pennsylvania, a lot of key races in the Senate. There's been a lot of debates happening as well, a bunch across all the states with these candidates. Let's play a little bit of some of these debates. And you can see right off the montage what side the Democrats are harping on issues-wise, what side the Republicans are harping on issue-wise. Let's take a look at this clip.
J.D. Vance raised money for the legal defense fund of the insurrectionists. This is the kind of extremism, J.D., that we wholly reject. You have video posts. Don't even try to deny it. We got your Twitter posts and everything else. Everybody's seen it.
The senator called the overturning of Roe versus Wade a victory. He celebrated the Dobbs decision. And he said that if women don't like the laws of their state, like the 1849 criminal abortion ban we have here, he said they can move.
The most extreme position here would be no limits on abortion whatsoever, allowing abortion right up to the moment of birth, which is what the lieutenant governor supports.
The thing the media and Congressman Ryan, they talk about this all the time. The thing they never mentioned is that poor girl was raped by an illegal alien, somebody that should have never been in this state in the first place.
Imagine someone decides, oh, there's a drop box, I'm just going to put some explosive in it and blow it up and burn all of those ballots, and now those votes don't count at all.
Look, and I'm really disappointed in you, Marco Rubio, because I think there was a time when you did not lie in order to win.
I've never pretended to be a police officer, and I've never threatened a shootout with the police.
Well, and now I have to respond to that.
We are moving on,
I
gentlemen.
have to respond to that. And you know what's so funny? I am with many police officers.
I'm so glad you put that.
I mean, it's a funny clip. There's a lot more that's happening in these debates out there. You can see already the focus, though, issues-wise, right? Abortion, immigration. You're making a face. We're both children of immigrants. So let's get each of your takes on some of the issues that Democrats and Republicans are harping on. We see it there in the messaging. What are some of your takeaways right now, the way these debates have gone across states?
Yeah, I mean, so some of these debates turn into a whole conversation about things that are not the issues, to the point of like bringing out the badge and turning into that. And in Pennsylvania, for example, it's become a conversation about if you know, Fetterman is fit to be in office because of auditory processing issues having after his stroke. So I see that in these races, a lot of it has turned into conversations that are not about politics or policy anymore, and it's more about like, let's do a sideshow of all these other things, which, I mean, that's up for debate. If those are issues that are important as well and stuff, but it's definitely not always focused on policy. However, when you talk to voters and you're getting a sense of what are the top issues on their mind, overwhelmingly it is the economy. Overwhelmingly there's a perception that the economy is doing poorly, that people are struggling, that prices have gone up, the conversation around gas prices. And again, people have different explanations for why that is happening. It's not like if gas prices went up, then automatically you think it's Democrats' fault. I mean, that just varies depending on who you're talking to and where you are geographically. But that's the big one. But Democrats, for example, have really focused in this election on the issue of abortion, and have seen that in the moment of, in the months coming since the Supreme Court decided to overturn Roe v. Wade, that they have seen that really energized voters, that really energized women, and they think that is kind of a winning argument looking at the election. But then on the Republican side, they do not want to talk as much about abortion, and they want to focus on crime and immigration, and really stoking these fears of, okay, crime is up, the border's out of control, migrants are coming. I mean, when you look at like Republican ads that I've spent countless hours following, that is just overwhelmingly what we're hearing.
Yeah. What about you, Ximena?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Sabrina just kind of gave you your answer. Is the economy and inflation is the top concern for voters right now. That is one of the top messages coming out of the Republican Party, whereas Democrats are by and large focusing on abortion and also on democracy, and kind of like this whole idea of democracy being at an immediate threat right now, whether or not in different races, that's coming up more or less. But voters, at the end of the day, do really care about how much they're paying for their food, how much they're paying for their gas, and that is a more upfront, immediate situation for them right now.
Idrees, a lot of the times foreign policy, I remember doing some focus group research with folks in FIU at Miami. We did something with some voters in Illinois. And when you ask people about foreign issues, what's happening with Russia, Ukraine, they don't seem to care. However, House Republicans have made it a point to say this Ukraine aid will stop. Where do you see, not only in the debate stuff, but like foreign policy issues are ranking really low because there's not anything that's happening right now besides Russia invading their neighbor, anything happening that they think is top of mind that will sway them to vote in one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. has also sort of crossed the post-9/11 era where they were engaged in actual foreign wars. There are obviously troops abroad. Afghanistan is done, the U.S. engagement. There are only a couple thousand troops in Iraq and Syria. So from that perspective, the U.S. engagement is limited. What always is interesting, and I know this happens every election cycle, foreign policy just doesn't play, but I think most Americans don't realize how much money is actually going to Ukraine, how much of their money is going to Ukraine. We're talking, tens of billions of dollars. So it always fascinates me where, the economy is obviously a big issue, money, but then when you talk about these massive spending bills, when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, not much attention is paid. With that being said, you brought up sort of McCarthy bringing up the fact that there would be more oversight into the money being sent. He's since sort of stepped back because McConnell came out and said, we're going to continue funding. So it's one of those actually weirdly rare areas where the Biden administration has done well and the Republicans aren't totally opposed to the money going. So to your point, it's not high on the agenda, but it's also one of those weird areas where everyone seems to agree on Russia, Ukraine.
Idrees, to follow that, if a scenario played out where Republicans were to get back control of Congress, and let's say funding for Ukraine is greatly diminished, from what you've seen in your reporting, what potentially is the impact to Ukraine and its war efforts fighting off the invasion, just from the U.S. not funding as much?
Yeah, I think they being the Ukrainians would be overtaken in a matter of months if U.S. funding went down significantly or ended, because the bulk of the money is coming from the United States. Most of the weapons are coming from the United States. So if that were to diminish in any way, that would really, really have a big impact, especially because winter's coming, and that's when most of the ground is going to sort of stay where it is, frozen. And if they don't have cold weather gear coming in, some of the longer range weapons, that could have a huge impact for the Ukrainians.
Sabrina, Ximena, question, something for you both to think about. It seemed like all those clips we played. Now, obviously, I do a podcast with Mike, so I obviously know the names of all these people featured. But even for everyone in our audience, it seems this time, and this is an assumption I'm going to put out there, that we're more aware of national races in midterms than ever before. Because typically, turnout in midterms is not great. And there's a lot of factors for that. But it seems this time around that there's just a national focus on every race in this country. Obviously, we saw, you were referencing, Sabrina, a moment ago, about the recent debate between Mehmet Oz and John Fetterman. And obviously, living in Pennsylvania, I'm watching that with my wife. But even Vance, in Ohio, against Tim Ryan. But where do you all stand on this from the coverage standpoint? Because you were talking before about not necessarily as reporters dictating what we all consume. But it just seems from an outsider's perspective, we've paid far more attention and provide a lot more coverage this time around with the midterms. Is that just a false premise I'm putting out there, or is that something you're all experiencing in your respective newsrooms?
So if I can go first, I have two thoughts. The first is that, we do have to recognize we're in a pretty dramatic bubble, and so we are aware, but I don't know that a lot of my friends or family back home in Idaho know who Herschel Walker is, for example. They know who Dr. Oz is because he's been famous for a really long time, so that might enter more. But in terms of Carrie Lake or, some of these other candidates in other states, I don't necessarily know that there's as much attention into it. However, I will say that I think when it comes to the coverage, particularly on my end, we are being asked to look at these national trends a lot more in terms of drawing parallels between races in different states. And so that, I think, might be different than it has been done in the past. But in terms of just the general public generally knowing about what's happening in one state or another, I don't necessarily know that that's true. I mean, I'll be really honest, I haven't been covering the midterms almost this whole time until maybe 2 weeks ago, because I'm more of a policy reporter, not a politics reporter. And then I got told about a week ago I was going to go to Arizona for election day, and I was like, oh, okay. And I've been learning about what's happening in Arizona, but so far it's been, a blind spot even for me, and I'm in this world, and I had to write some pre-writes ahead of election night, and a lot of Googling got done. So it's
the
not,
secret sauce, Googling.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not, I don't think it's as, mainstream as we think it is.
What about you, Sabrina, on the next point?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more attention, again, from the media, and I think nationally when we're talking about, if you're in DC and you're a Democratic consultant and maybe you only focused on governor's races in the past and didn't pay attention as much to the overall landscape, that has changed. And I think that changed in large part because of so many people being shocked in 2016 that Trump won. I think a lot of people were not, a lot of media organizations, a lot of people in politics were just not prepared for it. They thought like, oh yeah, Clinton's gonna win because the polls said. And I think that's where that stems from a little bit, that then it was like, okay, wait, like we have to be paying more attention to this, we have to be covering it. I think also the conversation around January 6th, the conversation about the state of democracy, I think people are more concerned about the stakes of the midterm elections because there are so many people running for office right now that are election deniers, that believe in overturning elections, that have not, will not say if they will accept the results of elections. And I think there's even more attention to more races now. So it's not only that people are paying attention to, okay, all the Senate races. Senate races generally did get attention because, okay, the future of, who has the majority and such. But for example, I feel like I've never paid attention, frankly, to Secretary of State elections. And now I know what's going on in some states because you're saying, oh, wait, if that person doesn't want to certify results, then like we have a whole problem.
Right. Well, you fed perfectly into the segue, almost as if I sent this to you via email, because let's prep Ximena on Arizona, and we're going to play a little game with 3 journalists to cover or not to cover. You mentioned Kari Lake. You mentioned election denial. We have somebody that's running for the highest land in a particular state that says things like this.
A lot of these individuals are seeking asylum. They are fleeing political violence in countries like Guatemala and Honduras. Do you accept that the U.S. has a responsibility to accept those asylum seekers?
Well, the vast majority of the people coming across don't really meet the criteria for asylum. There's a lot of fraudulent asylum claims that are being made. We've had 5 million people come in, and we've had 1 million of them called gotaways. That means we're not even processing them. They want to avoid capture because they have criminal records.
Well, DHS says that less than 1% of migrants encountered at the border have a criminal record. But I want to stick on the question of asylum. Those that do meet the criteria, should they be allowed to stay in this country?
Dana, I'm going to have to disagree with you on that figure you just put out. We have 1 million gotaways. These are people who are intentionally entering this country, mainly through the Tucson sector, and we don't know what their background is.
Okay, so a lot there to process. Let's start with you first, because you were a former immigration reporter. Oh, how convenient. Almost as if I invited you on for that particular reason. I was recently on the Rick Sanchez News podcast. We were talking about Kari Lake and giving actual statistics around fentanyl, how many migrants come into this country with fentanyl. Newsflash, it's less than 0.02%. These are according to the DEA and CBP statistics. Somebody like that is running for office. How hard is it to cover or not cover? Because a lot of the things she just said there are false. So how do you cover somebody, even though they're running for governor of the state, when you know everything they're saying is blatantly a lie? Not my fact, not your fact, not even Kari Lake's fact, an actual fact.
I am triggered. No, I mean, it's a huge challenge for sure. And the reality is that the vast majority of Americans do not know what the actual statistics are. I mean, before I covered immigration, I didn't know what the statistics were. Those are, I think, informed by your opinion on the issue, where you would listen to her, and if you are sympathetic towards the issue of immigration, or that's something you follow closely, then you'd be like, there's no way that's true. But if you are someone that cares about immigration or lives in Arizona and is saying like, there's too many migrants here, then you hear that and you say, oh yeah, absolutely. I think the challenge, and I will not speak for broadcast and TV, I am one of the people too that's kind of stands true to like print media is where it's at. I mean, I think it is important to cover. She might win. This is not like a candidate that is, a third party getting 2% of the vote. Like, she may very well become the next governor of Arizona, so we do need to cover her. We do need to know what she's saying. We do need, especially if she's going to win a majority of the vote, because there are millions of people in the state of Arizona that agree with her and feel that way. But I think that the important part of that is that if I'm going to write a quote from what she said there, then it's going to be followed up with statistics from U.S., from the statistics from DHS say this. These are what the facts are. These are what, that is something important. I think that we can't be writing about this as like, oh, she said it, so it must be true. Like, there is that piece of accountability that I think is critical in journalism.
Ximena, what about you? You're getting set to cover this woman, and potentially if she wins.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely a line where it's like she could win and she is a prominent enough figure that what she says does matter, but you do need to put it in context. Because I am more of a policy reporter and less of a politics reporter, sometimes I struggle with like, well, just because someone says something on TV, does that mean that it's news? And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes maybe we should just be writing a bigger story on immigration policy and including these caveats, in there as well. So I think it depends.
Idrees, what about you covering foreign officials and then U.S. officials? We saw what happened with John Kirby and the Pentagon when everything happened in Afghanistan. You wrote that article when you came on our show. That a lot of people loved that article in terms of the summary of Afghanistan and the withdrawal. What are some of your takes on to cover or not to cover and how to cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think the media learned one of the silver linings for the press was how to cover, non-facts when Trump came into office. And I think most of the media, when he started saying he was running, sort of took it as a joke. We covered it, but it was like, haha. There was never sort of this fact-based context that came afterwards. And I think over the past 6 years, we've learned how to cover people who don't always stick to facts. So I think that's one of the benefits. A lot of the Republican, people who are running for office do mirror a lot of foreign officials who don't stick to facts or have their own facts, and so it definitely is reminiscent of that. And one of the, I totally agree. You have to cover these people because, our job is to show the American people and who they're going to be voting for, and if they're crazy, we have to show that. If they're sane, we have to show that. So, one of the easier tactics, I think, is to write up what they're saying with the context. As a wire, that becomes a bit tougher because we have to be very quick and we don't have a lot of space. We can go over 300 words in our stories. So, having people say something and then having the context becomes a bit tougher, but it's, I think, extremely important.
Sabrina, you mentioned rightfully feeling triggered by that clip. I think most of us were, because of how fallacious the statements were, and racist, if we're just going to be honest with ourselves for a moment. But for the three of you, what roles we just saw Dana Bash offer one piece of pushback of well, it's actually this percent. Very just matter-of-factly. But where do you all stand? Again, we've all talked about, you're all not in necessarily the television space. You've all sometimes have done hits, but it's not where you reside in the work that you do as journalists. But what is the role of someone of Dana Bash in that case where you're being confronted with just absolute falsehoods? Do you, at that point, just stop the program and say, we need to have a conversation about this? Because most recently, we've seen at least two examples from someone who's not a journalist in the form of Jon Stewart, talking recently with a member of the Arizona, I forgot what.
Arkansas.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, in Arkansas, about abortion, about statistics about abortion, medical data, and confronting the Attorney General of what you're saying is wrong here. And then most recently with Arizona, about election data, and a person who could not admit that Joe Biden had won the presidency legitimately. And this person was just kind of throwing facts and figures. But here's someone in that space saying, what you're saying is incorrect. To someone like Dana Bash and to other people on television, what is the role of a reporter or journalist when confronting just repetitive falsehoods?
I think the number one thing is going into an interview prepared. I think for Dana Bash, for any reporter on TV and any reporter off TV, if I'm going to be interviewing someone, and period, actually, I'm not even going to say someone that has a history of lying or someone that no, if you're going to interview anyone, you have to go into that interview prepared, because I need to know that when you answered that question and you answered it falsely, that I can say back to you, but actually, these are what the DHS statistics say, but actually, this is what that looks like. If I don't have that knowledge, then that whole interview is going to be Carrie Lake saying what she thinks, her saying statistics that don't exist. And I just don't have the knowledge, I don't have the tools to be able to do my job. So I think that's critical. I will say, though, as a journalist, it's hard. And I'm not like a anchor or anything like that having to do it, but I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge in interviews when someone's giving you false numbers and stuff, and I'm on a phone call with someone. It's do I just let them continue? Do I interrupt them? Do I push back on that question? Do I just move on to the next question? I think we're all human, and that's a challenge that I think we all face.
What about you, Ximena?
Yeah, I think emphasizing the just being as prepared as you can yourself. And if you know that you're going to be speaking to someone that might have a certain spin, be aware of that. Everyone's going to have their biases, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're spreading misinformation, but they're going to come at whatever your question is with a certain angle. And even if it's just like intense Googling again, like I have definitely Googled facts and figures on a phone call because someone says it and I'm like, I want to check that. And sometimes it's true, sometimes it's outdated data, and then I can be like, well, that is from 2005. Do you have anything more recent? So that, don't be afraid to push back.
Idrees, last point for you.
No, I would just say, in this instance and in TV, I think part of the responsibility goes to the producer who is in the earpiece, who probably has Google or whatever at their fingertips. So I think a lot of responsibility should go on the producer who's not actually on TV.
Well, listen, the state of journalism is in good hands because Reuters foreign policy correspondent Idrees Ali's got you covered overseas. Ximena Bustillo over at NPR, Sabrina Rodriguez at the Washington Post. They've got you covered here on the domestic issues. Go follow all of them on social media. Check out their articles. Our thank yous to them. Give them a hand for being on the panel. Hey, thanks for watching the Can We Please Talk podcast. Whatever clip you just watched, we hope you enjoyed it. And we hope you stick around for some more. Subscribe to the channel. My partner's over here smashing the button. Come on, do them a favor. So hit subscribe.